And you could even envisage using the Republican Guard in a sort of sanitized capacity because it was an effective body of people.
The sense I had about the Republican Guard was that they were largely composed of professional soldiers. Saddam was supposedly an admirer of Stalin, and he had certainly political, or the equivalent of political commissars in place. And at one stage, I think in the fighting, one division surrendered, or at least the commanding officer surrendered. He then suddenly went back to fighting. Partly, I understood, because his family were being held, and he was told in no uncertain terms what would happen. So there was that element of political involvement in the Republican Guard. But nevertheless, our judgment was that, by and large, it was more important that they were soldiers than it was that they were supporters of Saddam Hussein. So, hence the argument that they were a force for stability.
Okay. Now, if we take the area that we were in charge of, the southeastern box. Initially, as you described earlier, things were very good. You could wander around Basra in April. But they started turning nasty fairly quickly. There were riots in August. And then as you go through to the spring of 2004, you really start to get a big rise in the level of violence and the beginnings of the Shia insurgency there. Now, how did we react to this? Was there a question of sending more forces in to reinforce the troops that we had there, which we had drawn down to a large extent?
Well, there was certainly a discussion about that. There was also a discussion about getting more contributions from more countries. I think overall there were something like 30 countries involved in the post-conflict phase. As you will be aware, they were distributed in different areas of the south, with each country taking responsibility for its part of the operation. So it wasn't simply for us to determine that in the south. It was work that we did in coalition. I think equally it's important that the problems that have developed in security terms were not all of one kind. The criminality, I recall someone blaming some of that initially, at any rate, on the fact that Saddam released all of his prisoners prior to the invasion. Some of the looting was clearly directed against institutions associated with Saddam. So some of the public buildings that were looted, I was told, because of this was a way of some of the population getting back at Saddam and his regime. Equally, there were some tensions between Sunnis and Shia in the south, but not on the scale, obviously, further north. As you mentioned, there was real tension within the Shia community. Badr al-Sadr, I assume, making a bid for control and power, probably under some Iranian influence as well. So there were a range of different causes for the problems, and I think the challenge for us really was how did we deal with that in security terms.
And what was the answer?
Well, ultimately the answer was to train and equip Iraqis to do both policing and the military part, because equally at a certain stage, and I don't think it's possible to say precisely when, but I recall warning of this, at a certain stage foreign soldiers are perceived to be occupiers, even if they are initially seen as liberators. That attitude does not last for that long. And particularly, one of the reasons why Iraq did not split into three smaller countries was that there is a sense of Iraqi nationalism. It has taken hold. There is a sense in which people are Iraqis first and Shia and Sunni second. And that focus eventually, inevitably, turns against foreign soldiers. So
the ultimate solution is to train Iraqi security forces, but that takes time.
It does.
And so in this period, when the security is deteriorating really increasingly and quite rapidly, and we're waiting for an ultimate period when we've got Iraqi security forces to do the job, what did you feel we should be doing about it?
Well, we needed to maintain our ability to deal with the outbreaks of violence, which I think we did very successfully, and to go on with the kinds of training, police, soldiers, the reconstruction, the rebuilding, because ultimately this is about hearts and minds, about the attitude of the Iraqi people. There was not a complete breakdown in law and order. There were some pretty nasty incidents, some where British soldiers died, but nevertheless, these were outbreaks. So this was not a persistent disorder, and therefore the task of British and other soldiers was to contain those outbreaks, but at the same time to move forward in terms of reconstruction and training.
But by 2005, wasn't there a situation in the area where we led that in which there was a feeling that this was slipping out of our control, that we weren't actually being successful in containing what had become a pretty high level of attacks, although it got worse later?
I'd still say that it was important at that stage to accept that there was some deliberately targeting foreign soldiers, deliberately there were some elements of Al-Qaeda in the south, not as much as further north, foreign fighters who were trying to provoke violence both within and between the Shia and Sunni community, and car bombs in Najaf, attacks on people at prayer, and so on. Actually, and I don't think that he has ever been given sufficient credit, during that period I developed a huge admiration. I've never met him, for a man called Sistani, who was their spiritual leader. I think without him and without his influence, his ability to restrain the Shias from retaliating to appalling provocation, and moreover his ability to calm Badr al-Saddah's people, I think we would have got to that stage. But he was an immense restraining influence, and I developed an enormous admiration for him, simply because whenever these problems began, he seemed to be able to calm everyone down during a period when, I wouldn't say it was understandable that people would resort to violence, but some of the incidents around the mosques, some of the attacks on Shias at prayer, deliberately designed to try and inflame the situation, he simply accepted that this was provocation and people should not retaliate.
But one of the problems was we couldn't really do the hearts and minds work when the security situation got bad. As we've heard from many witnesses, this is a vicious circle, and if the security is bad, you can't win the consent of the population by doing reconstruction projects and so on. So a lot of our quick impact work, a lot of our development work became impossible because the security situation was slipping out of control.
I wouldn't say that was a consistent picture across all of the South. There were places where it was extremely difficult, and places where perhaps the work did not proceed, but equally during those periods there was still reconstruction work going on elsewhere.
And if we turn to the training of security forces, this fell into two parts, the police and the army. Did you feel that the targets that in the early stages of this operation we were setting, approved at the highest levels in Whitehall, for numbers to be trained, were realistic, or were they overambitious?
I certainly thought at the time that we were not getting, the Ministry of Defence were not getting the kind of help that we had expected, particularly as far as police training was concerned.
From?
Well, again, part of the plan was that there would be police from the United Kingdom seconded to provide that training. Some went, but not nearly enough, and I don't think we had the capability to provide that kind of training to the extent that we wanted.